Opening the center immediately, this pawn advance aims for rapid development and a battle for space. Opens the Sicilian, a dynamic battleground where black immediately challenges white's central ambitions with asymmetrical pawn structures. Developing the knight here immediately challenges black's pawn structure and prepares for central pawn advancement. Opening the diagonal for the queen's bishop and bracing the center sets the stage for a dynamic Sicilian defense. Embracing unbalanced play. Challenging black's central pawn structure immediately opens lines and demands a sharp response. Opening the c-file now forces white to react, creating dynamic play rather than a passive position. Recapturing the pawn opens lines for the king's bishop and prepares to challenge black's central pawn structure. Unleashing the knight to its natural outpost. Black immediately challenges white's central pawn majority and prepares for castling. Instantly developing a piece to its natural outpost asserts central influence and prepares for kingside castling, creating a dynamic equilibrium. Securing the b5 square prevents white's knights from landing there. A subtle but crucial prophylactic maneuver in this Sicilian setup. Gaining crucial central influence. This bishop proactively aims to support pawn advances and potentially launch an assault on black's kingside should the opportunity arise. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing to develop the bishop. This maneuver gracefully cedes a slight tempo in exchange for structural integrity, paving the way for a potential b5 expansion and a more dynamic queenside presence. Pushing the f-pawn boldly grabs central space and aims to build a powerful kingside pawn chain, potentially preparing g4 gram5 to destabilize black's position. Expanding aggressively on the queenside. This thrust challenges white's central control and aims to seize vital space, potentially disrupting white's kingside attacking plans by forcing a reassessment of pawn structures. A bold declaration to confront black's queenside expansion, seeking immediate counterplay and a clear targeting of the g7 pawn's diagonal. Bringing the bishop to b7 aims to solidify control over the long diagonal, creating a potential threat on white's queen and castled king, while simultaneously preparing for kingside castling. Developing the bishop here aims to free up the d-file for the rook and prepares for potential castling kingside, while also eyeing the central dark squares. Solidifying the knight's position on d7 creates a flexible defensive structure. Anticipating potential pawn pushes in the center and preparing for a controlled buildup of forces on the queenside. Unleashing a flank attack. White gambles on seizing the initiative by aggressively advancing the kingside pawns, aiming to cramp black's position and potentially open lines for an assault on the enemy monarch. Though this aggressive posture might leave white's own king slightly exposed and demands careful defensive coordination. Challenging white's central pawn push head-on. Black lunges forward, creating immediate complications and a positional dilemma by seizing open diagonals and threatening to unravel white's queenside structure. Preparing a rapid advance on the kingside by potentially rerouting the knight to g3. Aiming to bolster the pawn storm while subtly challenging black's pawn on b4, which now occupies a key square that was previously defended by the departed knight. Unleashing a knight from its starting square. This move injects immediate dynamism, challenging the central pawn structure and creating a tactical skirmish. Black is actively seeking to disrupt white's queenside pawn advance and open lines for counterplay. A bold territorial grab. White advances the knight to its new outpost, aiming to disrupt black's queenside expansion and potentially reroute for an attack on the kingside. Black solidifies their presence on the queenside and prepares to challenge white's central grip. aiming to leverage the queenside pawn mass for potential breakthroughs. Pushing the g-pawn again intensifies the kingside storm, aiming to pry open lines against black's monarch. The tension on the kingside escalates dramatically, forcing a critical decision from black regarding their defensive setup. Disengaging the knight from the central fray, the defender reroutes its steed towards the kingside, preparing to support the potential pawn thrusts or perhaps pivot to a more active square should opportunities arise. This repositioning, while seemingly passive, creates a fluid defensive structure and avoids committing the knight to a potentially vulnerable advanced outpost so early in this complex Sicilian battle. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, the pawn at h4 aims to drive back black's knights and potentially open lines towards the enemy monarch, embodying a direct, aggressive strategy that demands careful calculation from the defender. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure and preparing a potential kingside counter-thrust. This move endeavors to restrict white's advancing pawns and create a more robust defensive shell around black's monarch. White finally secures the king behind a pawn wall, a vital step before continuing the pawn storm. Observe how this castling act subtly rearranges the pieces, creating a potential battery on the kingside and preparing to redeploy the knight from g3 to a more active square. It's a move that signals an intention to press the attack, but also acknowledges the latent counterplay black might achieve if white's own king becomes too exposed down the road. Black shifts the bishop to a more robust diagonal, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially open lines for counterplay on the queenside, while simultaneously reinforcing the e6 pawn. Breaking open the queenside pawn structure with this pawn advance aims to disrupt black's kingside development and potentially create weaknesses around their monarch. Opening the center with a pawn thrust, black boldly challenges white's central control and aims to disrupt the pawn chain, forcing a decision about the central tension that has been building since move 3. White redirects the knight, seeking to bolster the kingside pawn advance while potentially eyeing the c5 outpost more aggressively or preparing a retreat to f2 if the queenside play becomes too intense. The apparent capture of the pawn on f4 opens a crucial diagonal for white's queen, now poised to eye black's kingside, and more importantly, sacrifices material for tempo and initiative, forcing black to react to white's aggressive kingside pawn storm in dynamic play. The queen, now free from its defensive duties on the d-file, decisively relocates to a more aggressive square, eyeing the kingside and maintaining pressure on the d6 pawn. Castling secures the monarch, tucking it away from the central storm brewing on the kingside where white's pawns are advancing aggressively. This defensive maneuver is crucial as the g-file will soon become a critical battleground. Unbalancing the pawn structure and centralizing a knight presents a fascinating positional dilemma. This knight repositioning aims to disrupt black's pawn chain on the queenside, potentially opening lines for attack or creating weaknesses later. By exchanging on circa 5, white proactively addresses black's queenside pawn majority, which, while currently static, could become a source of future counterplay. Consider the strategic trade-off. White relinquishes the strong central knight but gains tempo and forces black to recapture, potentially creating doubled pawns or a less harmonious pawn formation. This maneuver also opens the d-file for white's pieces, adding another attacking avenue. The knight on c5 was doing a good job of controlling key central squares and potentially supporting advances like d5. So removing it forces black to make a decision that will define the character of the middle game. Observe how this exchange influences the pawn structure and the control of crucial squares going forward. The knight's repositioning cleverly uncouples white's central pawn chain, creating a potential weakness on d4 that black can now probe. Opening the a-file creates immediate complications, forcing black to decide if the pawn's capture is worth the potential disruption to their queenside pawn structure. This gambit-like decision sets the stage for a sharp, tactical struggle where precise calculation will be paramount. Reclaiming central space and activating the knight to a more influential square. This maneuver prepares for potential pawn pushes on the kingside while simultaneously offering a defense against white's queenside expansion. Unifying the rooks for an assault on the kingside. This queen repositioning prepares for potential pawn thrusts while maintaining a watchful eye on the d5 square, which might otherwise become a weakness after further exchanges. Seizing the open file with the bishop, black aims to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the weakened structure around the king, hoping to create immediate tactical complications and perhaps a tempo gain by forcing the knight to reposition, establishing immediate pressure on the queenside pawn chain. White's rook insertion aims to exploit black's slightly exposed b-pawn and potentially disrupt the coordination of black's minor pieces. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn structure and potentially opening lines around white's king feels like a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly solid queenside by creating attacking chances for black's knights. Recentering the knight on e2 prepares for a potential pawn push on the kingside or a regrouping maneuver, while also safeguarding against immediate threats. Black's queen looks a bit exposed on c7, and by placing the rook on e8, it immediately prepares to challenge the open e-file, potentially leading to a battery with the queen or creating active pressure against white's kingside. White is injecting a dynamic element into the queenside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt black's potentially harmonious piece development and exploit the newly opened diagonal for the queen. This thrust not only challenges black's central pawn chain but also forces a decision regarding the pawn on circa 5, which has been a key player in black's queenside expansion. The resulting pawn exchanges could lead to an imbalance, potentially giving white an advantage in the race to create weaknesses or open lines towards the black king. Unveiling a subtle defensive maneuver. This placing of the rook prepares to contest the open file and simultaneously reinforces the d6 pawn, preparing for a potential kingside pawn push should white overextend. The rook's relocation to f2 aims to establish a battery on the semi-open f-file, a crucial avenue for potential attacking operations against black's castled king, while also preparing to support a pawn push with f4-f5. A classic Sicilian attacking idea. Unleashing the queenside pawn storm. Black bravely challenges white's central control and aims to create immediate counterplay, potentially destabilizing the g3 knight and forcing a response. Seizing the open file on the queenside. This pawn sacrifice is a bold attempt to unravel black's carefully constructed pawn chain. By opening up the queenside with bxa5, white aims to create immediate threats and potentially trap black's active bishop. The idea is to force black into defensive maneuvers, disrupting their queenside coordination and possibly exposing weaknesses around their king. White is willing to sacrifice material for dynamic play and open lines, a hallmark of aggressive Sicilian structures. This move injects significant tension, forcing black to accurately assess the consequences and respond with precision to avoid falling into tactical traps. A daring thrust to seize the initiative. Black injects dynamism into the queenside by actively engaging the doubled pawns, aiming to disrupt white's established structure and create new avenues for counterplay. Unlocking the a-file. This capture instantly transforms the pawn structure, creating a dynamic open file for white's rook. A potential pathway to exploit black's potentially weakened king position after the pawn push to g6. The queen repositioning now grabs the outpost on circa 5. A bold claim that forces white to confront the immediate threat of its penetration into your queenside. This isn't merely about capturing a piece. It's a declaration of intent to control the center and disrupt white's pawn structure. Consider the implications for white's king safety and the eventual fight for the open files that will surely arise from this dynamic. Seizing initiative. White injects life into the position by rerouting the rook, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares on black's queenside and potentially create infiltration possibilities along the second rank. A daring thrust aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure, sacrificing a pawn for potential counterplay. Repositioning the bishop to target the queenside pawn structure. This move eyes potential weaknesses stemming from black's recent queen excursion, while also preparing to contest the c-file should it open. The queen boldly ventures towards the king, potentially disrupting white's coordination while simultaneously offering itself up to attack. This aggressive positional gamble could either seize the initiative or lead to immediate material loss. Challenging black's aggressive pawn thrust by seizing the central queen's file. This maneuver simultaneously repositions white's queen to a safer, more active square, eyeing potential threats along the third rank while deterring further incursions on the queenside. Sacrificing material for significant attacking momentum often hinges on the follow-up. The queen's departure from the central squares now leaves white's king slightly more exposed. A situation black will aim to exploit with active piece play, particularly targeting the now undefended kingside. The rook finally captures the pawn, establishing a significant material advantage and setting the stage for a dominant endgame. A determined effort to activate the rook on the open A file, seeking any offensive potential despite the board's current immobility. However, this maneuver might leave the rook somewhat exposed and disconnected from the defense of the kingside. Seizing the open A file presents a direct challenge to black's recently established queenside presence, aiming to disrupt any lingering coordination. Emerging from its shell, the bishop on c6 asserts its claim over the long diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's nascent control of the light squares and prepare for potential incursions on the queenside. Shifting the king away from the centralizing pressure on the queenside opens up a safer haven, preparing to involve the monarch in the unfolding middle game dynamics. Initiating a decisive penetration into white's weakened queenside, the rook on a7 aims to exploit the open A file, creating immediate threats against the white king's immediate surroundings and potentially forcing concessions. Securing the outpost on e7 with the knight now creates a prickly situation for black's queenside pressure, potentially stifling any further inroads from the A file after the recent exchange of pawns. Suddenly seizing the open file with the rook offers a dynamic opportunity to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate a long dormant piece into the heart of the enemy position, potentially forcing concessions. Unlocking the rook's activity along the now open file. This capture forces a simplification, immediately altering the board's character as white seeks to leverage the exposed black king. Black finally seizes the open file, a welcome development after being cramped for so long, aiming to activate the rook and challenge white's bishop on the long diagonal. Securing the outpost with the knight redirects pressure, aiming to exploit the open files and potentially restrict black's remaining pieces from active participation. Prioritizing king safety after the queen exchange. This maneuver cleverly shifts the monarch to a more protected square, Evading potential checks down the g-file and freeing up the rook to participate in defensive duties. A subtle repositioning of the bishop, aiming to consolidate control over the a-file while simultaneously freeing up the knight for more dynamic deployment later. Activating the rook along the open file represents a crucial counter-thrust, seeking to exploit the potential weaknesses created by white's pawn structure in the centralized knight. Clearing the path to the kingside remains white's primary objective, and repositioning the rook allows for a renewed assault on black's defensive structure. Rallying the troops. This bishop repositions itself to a more active diagonal, aiming to influence the queenside and potentially offer support to the soon-to-be active rook on the a-file, while simultaneously avoiding the knight's present outpost. Initiating a strategic repositioning of the knight to a more menacing outpost on the queenside, threatening further queenside penetration. Activating the bishop to the kingside opens lines for potential piece activity and prepares to contest the g-file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and possibly target the king. Initiating a central consolidation. The bishop's relocation to e2 aims to support the e-pawn's eventual advance and prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm, while simultaneously defending against any immediate black counterplay. The rook's ambitious venture to the queenside opens up intriguing possibilities for piece activity and creates a potential outpost. The rook redeploys to the kingside to support an eventual pawn push, aiming to activate its dormant power and create new attacking avenues. The rook now repositions, seeking to exploit the open c-file, a strategic redeployment aiming for active piece play and potential pressure on white's queenside pawn structure. Exploiting the pin on black's bishop, white immediately aims to shatter the pawn structure and gain a decisive outpost for the knight on d6. Forcing a passive defense or further material concessions. A daring attempt to disrupt the enemy's king defense, leveraging the knight's newfound outpost. The monarch, now exposed by the preceding checks, faces a precarious situation, needing immediate defensive attention rather than further positional maneuvering, as the enemy's rooks and knights are poised to exploit the weakened king's safety. A desperate attempt to create some dynamism by unpinning the knight and potentially opening a line toward white's king, though it comes at the cost of further weakening black's pawn structure and leaving the king exposed to potential checks. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm is a desperate gamble, aiming to pry open lines and disrupt black's tightly coordinated pieces before the impending pawn materialization. The king's cover has been fatally breached, exposing a dangerous path directly to the monarch. Unveiling the bishop's predatory intent. This capture aims to dismantle black's pawn shield and create immediate threats against the exposed king. The black king, stripped of its protective pawns and exposed on the kingside, now faces a potential avalanche of white pieces coordinated to exploit this weakness. Knight repositioning opens avenues for a potential exchange sacrifice, aiming to weaken black's pawn structure. A surprising check emerges from the bishop, creating a temporary diversion by forcing the king into a specific square. The king scrambles to safety, a necessary retreat from the looming checkmating net being woven by black's pieces. Seeking refuge on a square that momentarily breaks the immediate threat. The king's desperate flight into the open is met with a swift, albeit temporary, reprieve as this check forces a final retreat, highlighting the precariousness of white's monarch surrounded by its own pawns.